11 men stood on a hillside outside Jerusalem and watched a man they had seen dead 3 days earlier walk, eat, and breathe in front of them. Then he told them to go tell the world. What happened to them after that moment isn't in most Bibles. It isn't in Sunday school lessons, but it is recorded in the letters of early bishops, in the memory of Roman churches built over specific graves, in martyrologies the early church kept with almost bureaucratic precision. Of those 11, tradition holds that only one died of old age. The rest were tortured to death across an empire that stretched from Britain to India for refusing to take back what they said they had seen, not for a doctrine, not for a moral code, for an eyewitness claim about a body. People die for beliefs all the time. That part isn't rare. What's rare is someone dying to defend a fact they would have had to personally fake. So what actually happened to Peter, to Thomas, to the others? And when you look closely, does the tradition hold up, or does it fall apart the way legends usually do under pressure? Here's the honest complication. The book of Acts, our best first century source, loses interest in most of the 12 almost immediately. It follows Peter for a while, keeps John at his side, records James, son of Zebedee's death in a single verse, and then spends its entire second half on Paul, who wasn't one of the original 12 at all. By chapter 15, 9 of the apostles have simply vanished from the text. Everything we know about what happened to them afterward comes from outside the canon, and it comes in different strengths. Eusebius of Caesarea, writing his ecclesiastical history in the early 4th century, drew on earlier sources now lost to us, men like Hegesippus and Papias, much closer to the events themselves. Alongside him sit the apocryphal Acts of Peter, Acts of Andrew, and Acts of Thomas, 2nd and 3rd century texts, often theologically embellished, sometimes describing talking animals or flying apostles, which is precisely why the church never accepted them as scripture. But historians don't discard them outright either. They apply the same tools used on any ancient source. Does more than one independent line converge on the same core detail? Does the detail embarrass or complicate the story rather than glorify it? Is the geography plausible for a first century traveler? Traditions that pass those tests get graded as probable. Traditions that don't stay graded as legend. That spectrum, not a flat yes or no, is the real story. Start with what Scripture itself actually says, because it's less than most people assume. Only one apostolic death is narrated directly in the New Testament. James, son of Zebedee, beheaded on the order of Herod Agrippa I. Acts 12, verse 2, one sentence. The Greek verb is analin, he killed by the sword. No elaboration, no scene. It's worth noticing the contrast. The same book gives Stephen's death, a few chapters earlier, an entire dramatic scene, speech and vision included. Stephen wasn't one of the 12. James was, and Luke gives him one clipped sentence. That alone suggests Acts was never trying to be a martyrology. Peter's death isn't narrated at all. It's predicted. In John 21, the risen Jesus tells him, "When you are old, you will stretch out your hands, and someone else will dress you and carry you where you do not want to go." John's own gospel adds the commentary immediately after, "This he said to show by what kind of death he was to glorify God." The Greek phrase for stretching out the hands, ektenestas cherasou, was read by early Christian audiences as a specific idiom, the posture of a body bound to a crossbeam. That's the entirety of what the Bible states outright about how any apostle died. Everything else comes from tradition, standing just outside Scripture's edge. Peter's tradition is the strongest of them because 3 independent lines converge on it. Tertullian, writing around the year 200, states plainly that Peter was crucified in Rome. Origen, quoted later by Eusebius, adds a specific detail. Peter asked to be crucified upside down, considering himself unworthy to die in the same posture as his Lord. And archaeology adds a third line entirely apart from any text. 20th century excavations beneath St. Peter's Basilica uncovered a first century grave the Roman Church had already been venerating as Peter's for at least 2 centuries before the current building existed. 3 unrelated kinds of evidence, pointing the same direction. Andrew's tradition holds together almost as well, bound, not nailed, to an X-shaped cross at Patras in Achaia, reportedly preaching to the gathered crowd for 2 days before he died, according to the Acts of Andrew. Thomas carries something unusual, a living community, as evidence. He is said to have been speared to death near modern Chennai, and the St. Thomas Christians of Kerala trace an unbroken presence back to a first-century founding they credit to him, entirely independent of any later European mission. A community that has existed continuously for 2,000 years is a harder thing to simply invent than a text is. Bartholomew was reportedly flayed alive in Armenia, a tradition old and firm enough that Christian art for 1,000 years has shown him holding his own skin, most famously in Michelangelo's Last Judgment. Philip was martyred at Hierapolis in Phrygia, a city built around a cult of a serpent goddess. Later tradition frames his death as the direct result of confronting that cult publicly. Matthew's tradition is genuinely split. Some accounts place his martyrdom in Ethiopia, others in Persia, and honest scholarship simply admits it doesn't know which. For James, son of Alphaeus, Simon, Jude, and Matthias, the traditions, stoning, clubbing, the saw, exist and are ancient, but the independent attestation behind them is thinner, and a careful accounting holds them more loosely than it holds Peter's, or Andrew's, or Thomas's. Two figures break the pattern entirely, and both are worth sitting with. John is the outlier. Tradition holds that he alone among the 12 died of old age, after an exile to the island of Patmos under the Emperor Domitian's persecution, where, Revelation 1 verse 9, tells us directly, he received the vision that became the apocalypse before dying peacefully in Ephesus around the year 100. It's worth noticing what that detail does to the whole tradition. If the early church had simply been manufacturing a uniform legend of glorious deaths to make a point, leaving one obvious survivor in the record works against the propaganda, not for it. A fabricated pattern doesn't usually include its own exception. Then there is Judas, who left the mission rather than continuing it. Matthew 27 says he hanged himself in a field later called Akeldama, the field of blood. Acts 1 says he fell headlong and his body burst open. These have been read as a flat contradiction for 2,000 years. But the reconciliation is old and unforced. A body hanging by a rope over rocky Judean terrain, left long enough for the branch or the rope to give way, is fully compatible with both descriptions. A fragment attributed to Papias, preserved by later writers, adds a grim and specific detail, the body swelling before it finally fell. Augustine later commented that the two accounts describe two moments of the same event, not two competing stories. The point of placing Judas beside John isn't the gore, it's the contrast the earliest Christians themselves drew deliberately in how they told these stories. 11 deaths framed as testimony, 1 framed as judgment. So what does a string of first-century martyrologies have to do with an ordinary week now? Not primarily the popular apologetic claim that people wouldn't die for something they knew was a lie. That argument is real but limited. It shows the apostles were genuinely convinced of what they preached. It doesn't by itself prove they were right, and careful apologetics admits that rather than overclaiming. The more useful layer is buried in the vocabulary itself. The New Testament's word for what these men were doing wasn't dying, it was martyrs, witness. English later narrowed that word down to mean only the death, but in the text itself, testifying was the point, and death was simply the cost some of them happened to pay for it. Jesus had told them this was coming, Matthew 10, John 15, not as a threat but as calibration. Expect resistance in proportion to what you're actually claiming. The later church, reflecting on the fact that most believers would never face a literal cross, developed a broader vocabulary for the same instinct. Celtic Christian writers spoke of red martyrdom for those who died, white martyrdom for those who gave up comfort and home for the faith without dying, and green martyrdom for the daily, unglamorous discipline of turning from lesser wants toward the harder good. For almost every believer today, the calibration never reaches physical death. It reaches something smaller and still costly. a friendship strained by conviction, an opportunity declined, an honest conversation not avoided because it costs something. The apostles' example isn't a threat to reenact. It's a scale to measure smaller costs against. 11 men on a hillside, and then decades of unglamorous, mostly undocumented deaths scattered across an empire that stretched from Britain to the Indian coast. What ties Peter's cross in Rome to Andrew's in Patras, to Thomas's spear near Chennai, to John's quiet grave in Ephesus isn't the manner of death. It's that none of them, not even the ones history remembers least clearly, is recorded as having taken it back. The honest version of the story holds real tension rather than smoothing it away. Some of these accounts are early and strong, some are late and thin, and a careful reading says so plainly instead of declaring the case closed or dismissing all of it as legend. What's harder to explain away is duller than either extreme. 12 ordinary men spent the rest of their lives insisting on one specific claim in a dozen different places, under a dozen different pressures to stop, right up until it killed most of them. What would it take for you to hold a claim that long, that far from home, under that much pressure, if you knew firsthand that it wasn't true?